Hi, folks. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I am going to ask if you could please find your seats at this time, and if my panelists could join us up here. We're going to have GRI Director Mike Tierney kick us off with some opening remarks.
Okay, folks, you heard my boss. Come sit down. Did everybody do the reading today? All right. Good evening. Welcome to William & Mary's Washington Center. I also want to welcome you if you are remote on YouTube, because I understand we are simultaneously broadcasting this event. Thanks for coming to participate in this important conversation. I'm Mike Tierney. I'm the director of the Global Research Institute. GRI is a multidisciplinary hub that brings together academics, students, and practitioners across a broad range of issue areas. We host 10 different research labs that range from international development finance to human rights, nuclear proliferation to global public health. You are all now on our mailing list because you are RSVP'd. So I'm just going to, if you haven't already, you're going to continue to get emails from me, keeping you updated on the activities at GRI, telling you how great we are. And for those of you who are in the room, there's propaganda on each of your seats. So check that out. At GRI, we are committed to using the best evidence and research methods to address important policy problems. The research we'll discuss tonight was produced to support the inaugural Gates Forum. The idea behind the Gates Forums is this: to produce original applied research on a topic of critical national security importance that can be used by policymakers and practitioners to inform decisions at the highest levels. In December, GRI partnered with William & Mary's Chancellor and former Secretary of Defense, Robert M. Gates. We focused on the issue of strategic communication in U.S. foreign policy. This is something that Gates wrote about in his most recent book. He argued that, among other non-military means, the U.S. had underinvested in strategic communication. Over 3 days, William & Mary hosted experts from the executive branch, from Congress, from higher education, the media, and the private sector. Today, we gather to discuss the research that Samantha Custer and her team at AidData produced to support the forum. The report is entitled Reputational Security, the Imperative to Reinvest in America's Strategic Communications Capabilities. Analyzing historical trends in U.S. foreign policy, the role of technology, and the narrative strategies of Russia, China, and Japan, this report served as the intellectual backbone for a discussion that centered around one question: what concrete actions can the U.S. take to reimagine its strategic communications capabilities in an era of intensifying great power competition? It's a question we'll discuss tonight with a very distinguished panel of experts. Before I turn it over, though, I want to thank those who made the Gates Forum possible. First and foremost, I'd like to thank William & Mary's president, Catherine Rowe. Without her commitment and her money, we literally wouldn't be here tonight. She believed in this project and in the partnership for the last 3 years, and she really helped to push it forward. Second, I want to thank our close partners in this endeavor, Chancellor Gates and his team at the Gates Global Policy Center. Most notably, General Pete Corelli and Kathy Condon, who is in the room for us today. Kathy, wave to everyone. Please say hello to Kathy during the reception. We've been at this for, I think, 3 years now. We'll be hosting a second Gates Forum later this year on international development assistance. And we're already working closely with our partners at GGPC on that. Third, I want to thank those at GRI and the William Mary Washington Center for making this possible. Erin Battle may not be in the room, but she is the Associate Director. If you haven't had a tour of the space, especially if you're a William Mary alum, you should seek out Erin during the reception and make sure she walks you around and shows you the facilities. Ryan Musto is GRI's, where are you, Ryan? There he is in the back. Ryan Musto is GRI's Director of Forums and Research Initiatives. He's the first historian that we hired at GRI, so it's not all data scientists, economists, and political scientists anymore. We're actively building bridges to the history department. The other person I need to call out is Cassie Keene. She's my boss. GRI's event specialist. She ran the logistics for the Gates Forum. It was wildly successful, and she is the reason that we have the spread that we're going to enjoy tonight after our conversation. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank Samantha Custer. She's the director of the Policy Analysis Unit at AidData, and she was the chief architect of the research volume that we used at the Gates Forum this year. Sam, you set an impressively high bar for future researchers that provide the research report for the Gates Forum, and so you're going to make it harder on those who come after you. The bad news is I know the person who's leading the research report for the second Gates Forum, which is also Sam. So it's going to be tough to fill those shoes, Sam. Thanks for blazing this trail and for your brilliant insight and leadership. I'll now turn the floor over to our moderator for the event, Tom Shanker. Tom participated in the inaugural Gates Forum this past December. Tom, as many of you know, is a journalist at the New York Times for nearly a quarter of a century. He's the co-author of Counterstrike, The Untold Story of America's Secret Campaign Against Al-Qaeda, a New York Times bestseller. He now serves as the director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University. Tom, it's great to see you again. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of the organizers and planners and people who've joined us this evening. It really is a great honor to be asked to be your guide through this evening's presentation by an absolute panel of experts. We're entering, I don't know, is it a new Cold War? Is it just a new age of danger? We haven't defined it yet, but clearly it's time for our definitions of national security and national power to expand and broaden from the Zoom-like focus on counterterrorism that we saw for the 20 years after 9/11. We have to sort of come up with a new definition of what it means to secure our vital interests, our reputation, our values, that goes way beyond the bombs and bullets. And as you'll hear this evening from these three really terrific people, this pursuit of new tools or improving the ones we have to defend our nation and its values is an incredibly important mission. So thank you all. Our run of show, Sam's already been introduced. She will spend some time guiding us through the content of this report, and then we'll have a couple of very wise commentators speak about it. We'll have a guided discussion, and then I'll invite all of you to join the conversation. Sam, over to you.
Okay. It's very loud. Thank you. All right. Way to start this thing off, man. All right. Everyone's awake. That was my objective here. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike and Tom, for the kind words of introduction, and to all of you for joining us here tonight. First, I owe a huge debt of thanks to William Mary Chancellor Bob Gates for the opportunity to be at this critical discussion about bipartisan action to ensure that America's strategic communications are a source of national strength rather than a vulnerability in advancing our interests. I should also say that this research would not have been possible without the phenomenal contributions of my AidData colleagues, as well as some guest contributions from people like Jessica Brandt, Nick Call, Maria Repnikova, and Nancy Snow, who are joining us here either in person. Wow. I'll use the handheld. All right. We'll roll with it. All right. Strategic communications snafus. All right. So I have about 10 minutes to surface insights from 8 papers spanning 7 decades, featuring in-depth looks from strategic communications as practiced by the US, 2 of our fiercest competitors, and 1 of our closest allies. But don't worry, I'm not going to attempt to summarize all of this for you, but you can nerd out on all of the papers that you can find online at aiddata.org later on, and even check out some data that we'll be releasing soon. So instead, I thought we could focus the conversation around 3 questions tonight. What are we talking about? Why does it matter? And what should we do differently? So what are we really talking about here? We know that administrations come and go, but what is interesting is that America's pursuit of influence as central to our national security interests has proven to be quite durable. If you look across the last 5 national security strategies issued by leaders from both parties, you'll find that they see that they argue that the United States must sustain its capacity to project influence in order to advance its national interest on a global stage. And of course, the US can exert influence in many ways. But strategic communications, here talking about broadcasting and public diplomacy, is a crucial ingredient to shape attitudes of foreign publics and foreign leaders to want what America wants. So let me give you the bottom line up front. The evidence is clear. In overemphasizing hard power, the US has allowed its soft power capabilities to atrophy at a time when we need them most. Part of this is a resourcing challenge. US federal budgets have increased over time, but strategic communications has attracted a declining share of these resources. By our estimate, the US government spends a mere 3 cents for every 100 federal dollars spent on civilian-led broadcasting and broadcasting and public diplomacy. Of course, more resources would be helpful, but they're not a panacea. Leadership, coordination, accountability are essential to ensure that strategic communications are effective in advancing our interests. And unfortunately, we're falling short on all 3 fronts. Strategic communications has suffered from inconsistent leadership. The Senate-confirmed position responsible for much of America's strategic communications has been vacant or held by an acting official for more than 40% of the time since its inception. That's grown to 90% of the time over the last 2 administrations. I'm really hopeful that this changes soon with a speedy confirmation for President Biden's new appointee and an alum of our First Gates Forum, Liz Allen. Strategic communications, I see Greg in the crowd here, is vulnerable to what Greg, I know, likes to call information fratricide. As multiple agencies carry out responsibilities with little formal coordination, at best they don't add up to more than the sum of their parts, and at worst they engage in friendly fire, unintentionally undercutting each other. You could also say that our strategic communications architecture that we have today is like the movie Back to the Future. Until recently, US government personnel tasked with broadcasting and public diplomacy responsibilities had to operate within a 50-year-old legacy structure from the 1970s using tools and job descriptions designed for the Cold War. Innovations like the Public Diplomacy Staffing Initiative are a step in the right direction, but there's still much work to be done to ensure that the US is able to attract, train, and retain the workforce we need to navigate a digital world. And then, of course, rather than enabling US efforts to tell its story well, America's archaic legislative frameworks often make it difficult to mobilize domestic support, crowd in private sector and civil society expertise, and hold ourselves accountable for results. So you may be asking, why does all of this matter? I would say vaguely defined aspirations of influence, limited resources, vulnerable to further cuts, and lack of specificity about how we define success from our strategic communications efforts create an unwinnable scenario here at home. But it also creates vulnerabilities for US interests much farther than beyond the Beltway. Not only due to lack of clarity about who we are trying to reach and how we are perceived, but also in the face of strategic competitors that are taking the offensive to dilute and diminish America's global leadership. Beijing's and Moscow's strategic communications may or may not be coordinated, but more importantly, they are reinforcing and compounding in ways that threaten U.S. interests. The Kremlin's efforts to undermine Western governments and institutions give China an opening to step in with an attractive alternative. When Beijing picks up and amplifies the Kremlin's propaganda, this offers a fig leaf of legitimacy to Moscow's claims. For China and Russia, state-run media is a global enterprise. Both have extensive footprints in countries across the world via print, radio, TV, and digital channels. And certainly these broadcasting capabilities are formidable, but I would argue that their impact is limited on their own because target audiences are more likely to view this as propaganda and discount their credibility. Instead, I would say that the ability of Beijing and Moscow to do something that I call borrowing local credibility, such as through content sharing partnerships, ownership stakes in local media, training and exchange programs with journalists in other countries are potentially far more problematic. And these pathways of influence are insidious because they have the potential to shape both what is covered and how it's covered, and it's much more difficult to track. Vulnerability is highest for countries with small media markets, few alternative sources of information, a high concentration of media in the hands of a few elites, and low transparency about who actually owns the media. Now more than ever, America needs to reinvest in its strategic communications capabilities. We need to be talking about how to exploit new communications channels and tactics to tell America's story. We must anticipate and respond to threats that compromise our reputation, and we must protect the health of our information ecosystem and those around the world. Okay, so hopefully I've gotten you hooked on why this matters. So what should we do differently? First, I would say we need to resist the temptation to go dollar for dollar in outspending Beijing and Moscow on broadcasting. Instead, we should undercut their ability to borrow local credibility. The U.S. should prioritize strategic communications efforts towards geographies and communities that are revealed priorities for China and Russia. Africa and Latin America are up-and-coming areas of interest for both, but these regions are relative afterthoughts in America's own strategic communications, both as a share of financing and as a congressional priority. This is a missed opportunity and an emerging vulnerability. Beijing and Moscow also enjoy virtual monopolies in influencing Chinese and Russian diaspora communities via local language content, a series of education and cultural exchange activities. And comparatively, these communities are a relative blind spot for the US. But as we focus on these areas, we need to avoid being supply-side driven and be mindful about being responsive to demand. U.S. strategic communications resonates with foreign publics more when we put in the spade work to understand our audiences up front, target our messages accordingly, and consistently monitor results over time. Second thing we should do differently, we will get more from our strategic communications efforts if we synchronize broadcasting and public diplomacy along with our other instruments of power to emphasize mutually reinforcing themes. So take China, for example. China's state-run media seeks to redefine international norms on human rights and raise up China's development model as one to which countries can aspire. These refrains are then reinforced by Beijing's education and training programs, which train journalists, law enforcement, justice officials, among other key demographics. China ensures that economic assistance is highly publicized, and its Confucius Institutes reinforce the appeal of studying abroad in China as a gateway to economic growth. Comparatively, if you look at Russia, these efforts are more focused on building upon pre-existing language and cultural ties with post-Soviet states, as well as shared values with foreign publics farther afield. Russian state media, for example, frequently mentions nationalist and far-right groups to heighten anxiety about rampant neo-Nazism to complement the Kremlin's educational efforts that feature its role in fighting Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Russian media also raises the profile of Eurosceptic parties, Orthodox churches, pro-Kremlin institutions, consistent with education and cultural efforts that focus on these actors while discrediting pro-European parties and organizations. In line with the Kremlin's emphasis on youth patriotic education, Russian state media also seeks to position its actions in Donbass, Crimea, along with peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh as indicative of the Kremlin serving as a natural security partner. The same degree of consistency of these refrains does not appear to be the case for U.S. strategic communications. And that's partly a reflection of the challenge of interagency coordination, as well as lack of clarity about how broadcasting and public diplomacy advances our national interests. Third and finally, to compete and win in what the Biden administration has coined a contest to win the future of our world, the U.S. needs a strategy that's rooted in democratic values, requiring action within and beyond the information domain, as well as working together with allies. It's easier than ever before for states to couple automated bots with human curation to flood the information domain with false and sensationalized information. And this creates a fire hose of falsehood that's really difficult to counter and control. But there are opportunities for the US to gain advantage. We can mobilize investigative journalists, open source researchers to surface and discredit deceptive information. We can use targeted financial sanctions against individuals and outlets associated with disinformation. We can use educational programs to increase media literacy of the general public. America often goes it alone rather than pooling resources with allies. And that makes it difficult in practice to share the cost of producing and distributing broadcasting content and advance shared values. Closer to home, there are untapped opportunities to leverage a second unique strength, the vibrancy of America's free and open society. Universities, celebrities, companies, civic groups are unpredictable, but they engage with foreign publics, and as they do so, they effectively become part of U.S. strategic communications efforts, whether they're planned or not. And rather than trying to control or constrain these efforts, we have an opportunity to be stronger if we mobilize and partner with these actors to crowd in their expertise, support, and operational capacity. But this will require overcoming some legislative hurdles and changing entrenched cultural norms that make these partnerships difficult to execute in practice. So at the end of the day, embracing a new normal for U.S. strategic communications requires the following: a clarity about what we want to achieve, getting the incentives right to invest in what works, not just what's been done before, listening to and learning from those that we want to reach well beyond the Beltway, and leveraging expertise from our allies and partners and groups outside of the government to do more with less. And so with that, I'll turn things back to Tom and look forward to hearing from insights from Vivian, Sean, and all of you. Thank you.
Sam, thank you for that terrific tour across the horizon. If I were a book reviewer, I would definitely recommend the report for those who haven't read it yet. It's deeply researched. It's actually really well written for an academic study. You can zip right through it. So that's a two thumbs up from here. It's time now to have two expert commentators who are deeply familiar with the research share some thoughts with us before we move to Q&A. Vivian Walker is Executive Director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. She's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a member of the Foreign Service Journal editorial board. Sean Powers is currently the Director, Strategic Planning and Communications, Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, U.S. State Department. And for those of you who did not know such an institution even existed, it's brand new. Prior to that, Sean served as the U.S. Agency for Global Media's Chief Strategy Officer. And with that, Vivian, I invite you to share some thoughts.
Great. So I'm assuming that we are okay with the mics. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this distinguished panel, and thank you for that outstanding series of reports. Truly, I found in particular your work on the Russia and China chapters to be presenting data on the issues in ways that I had never seen before. And in fact, I'm commending them to my students at Georgetown as sort of resources and models for the practice of really kind of bridging that gap between what we call a gap between data and diplomacy. So thank you so much for the great work on that. I'm just going to make a few comments today from my perch on the U.S. Advisory Commission for Public Diplomacy, which, for those of you who might not know, it's an independent federal advisory commission who has a congressional mandate to assess U.S. government public diplomacy activities, both within the Department of State as well as in the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And of course, I have to acknowledge that my predecessor on that commission is none other than Sean Powers. So. And our role is essentially to understand what's going on and to make recommendations and assessments. And I will have to say that much of what Samantha had to say just now in terms of identifying both the problem sets, but also talking about some of the possibilities for change or for reform are very much consistent with our own insights. And so I'm very glad to hear so many of them borne out in your report. So thank you for that. So just, again, a few quick comments. I can't pretend to recapture the breadth of Samantha's comments, but I just want to point out a few things. Actually, here we go, starting with the title. I truly appreciate this focus on reputational security, about firmly linking public diplomacy, strategic communications, a country's power, its ability to project its soft power legitimacy in the global information space with national security. Public diplomacy is an essential part of our ability to defend our interests, both our security interests and our economic interests. And I don't know that we emphasize that enough and broadly. So thank you for really making that the starting point for the discussion. The second thing I'd like to say, and I'm still on the title, so this could be long, but I promise you won't be, is the imperative to reinvest in U.S. strategic communications. You said reinvest. You did not say reinvent. I have to say, as a former public diplomacy practitioner, I've been in the business now 35 years. I know that because I went to just now the retirement party of somebody I began with many years ago in state. For 35 years, I have seen numerous reports that come out periodically and say public diplomacy is broken, strategic communication is broken, and we need to start all over again and get it right. What I like about Reinvest is acknowledging all that has gone before, all of the people and programs and institutions that are in place. More work needs to be done, but from the perspective of building on what already exists and making it better. Investment suggests a hope for the future, and I really see that. So that just those two words really frame an approach in this report that I think is really good. Then just about three comments that touch on some of the issues that you've raised. The issue of alignment, of coordination of effort and coordination of messaging when it comes to public diplomacy, strategic communications. This question is a perennial one that we are always revisiting, and it arises, it appears in multiple forms. Sometimes it appears that there isn't cohesive messaging across the government, or we're not consistent about the way in which we approach key issues. Sometimes we're struggling with what Admiral Mullen famously called many years ago now the say-do gap, that gap between what we say our values and principles are and our actual policies and actions that may seem to be inconsistent with those ingoing values and principles. That too contributes to this sense of lack of cohesion. And there is that also perennial disconnect between our policy aspirations, particularly when it comes to what public diplomacy can achieve, and the available resources. I would just say that I understand that the budget has come out for public diplomacy, and really there are some serious flat lines or cuts once again for public diplomacy activities in the department. So this is a perennial issue. Second point, and here a little bit of a slight quibble. You talked about strategic patience, and I couldn't agree more. I think you acknowledge in the report very well that it does take time to see results, to see impacts, particularly when you're talking about the practice of public diplomacy, which the classic definition, of course, is to inform and influence external audiences in the service of your national security interests, your economic interests. Informing audiences, okay, influencing, changing perceptions and behaviors, that's a much longer game. So we call for, and that is strategic patience, waiting for those outcomes, and yet we can't seem to wait for those outcomes. We are constantly, what have we done? What have we achieved? How can we justify continuing what we're doing? So this concept of strategic patience is the ideal, but something that's very hard to achieve in this environment. And finally, as you point out, the competition between, from Beijing and Moscow and other authoritarian capitals is certainly a huge challenge, and it is an asymmetric challenge. And I think the reality is, and you acknowledge it very nicely in your report, is that it's always going to be asymmetric. We are never going to be able to compete with China or Russia in terms of resources, that they put toward their influence activities, nor would we want, I would wager, to behave as China and Russia do in the pursuit of their influence objectives. We can't play that game. So I think we have to embrace that asymmetry and go for what we might want to call a containment strategy for the digital age. I think you probably, all of you are students of international relations here, so you know Kennan's strategy of containment. And one important component of that containment strategy was, instead of engaging in direct attacks on, for example, the Soviet Union at the time, would rather, the idea of containing the Soviet Union was doing it through providing alternative models, modeling freedom of the press, modeling democratic institutions, and through that attraction over time, containing the influence. And I think we can do the same thing here. And you said it. It's containment through the continued, through leveraging our own credibility, through the promotion of our democratic values, and not only in promoting our democratic values, but modeling them in the process. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for being. Sean, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you so much. I want to start by saying thanks to our friends and colleagues at GRI and William & Mary and AidData and Secretary Gates as well, not just for this, but for raising the profile of public diplomacy and strategic communications writ large. I think the work that you all are doing to emphasize the centrality of these activities, broadly speaking, to U.S. foreign policy, is a service to this nation. And I really am grateful for that, because I think it's getting much more attention because of the forum in particular, but the work that you all are doing. And as a important sub footnote or a footnote, really want to call out the impressive data-driven empirical research that you all are pursuing. It adds a level of rigor and an impressive insight that has not always been the case in this field. So thank you for that. To start things out, I'll be short, but I want to mention three things, sort of three reactions / comments on the terrific report, Reputational Security, to try to widen the aperture a little bit of the conversation and to try to make a case for thinking about strategic communications in a broader light. And the first thing is just noting the centrality and importance of communication technologies and platforms in all things public diplomacy and strategic communication. And what I mean by that is, it's not just about the messages and the programs. We have to think about how we're actually going to communicate and engage with publics around the world. What platforms are we going to use? What wires are we going to be using on those platforms, or is it going to be a satellite instead? And what rules are governing those platforms and that architecture to understand what's possible? And to connect it to the report, Sam makes a strong case, Sam and colleagues make a strong case for the need to recognize that we are in a Cold War-like battle for strategic influence. But one part of the war, of the Cold War, was fighting for international norms that supported the free flow of information around the world, right? The fact that transnational flows of information were not bounded by sovereignty the same way almost every other aspect of life was and is. It was an incredible victory for the United States and the West in the 20th century. And I think I and many others are deeply concerned that those norms and policies that guarantee the free flow of information and data around the world are at jeopardy, both at the normative level in terms of the policies that guide these things, but also at the technological level. If we're dependent on platforms that say, don't embrace the Western values that I know everyone here believes in, what restrictions will that leave us? What opportunities will that not provide us when it comes to public diplomacy and strategic communication? So I want to kind of foot stomp the need to think about not just the message, but also how we're going to convey the message and the rules that govern that message, because it is a substrate that cuts across all of these other public diplomacy activities. Second point is to kind of rip on the title meme, which I like here, is to push it one step further and say it's not just about reinvesting in strategic communications capabilities, but it's also about investing in strategic communications pathways. And what I mean by that is, and this is a self-criticism as much as anything else, public diplomacy practitioners need to start thinking about their programs and their messaging as investments that are part of a long-term pathway, a life cycle that will eventually invest in a person or an organization for the purpose of improving their capabilities of achieving some policy of shared interest. And if you start to think about public diplomacy programs as an initial investment and a follow-on investment in a person or an organization, and you start to map out these pathways, what's a good way to follow up with an exchange program? Say the DoD invests in a humanitarian assistance project in pick a country. What's a good public diplomacy program to follow up on that, provide training perhaps to emergency responders in that country so they can learn how the DoD was able to do it so effectively. And you start to connect these dots of pathways that ideally researchers, like many of the folks in this room, can actually study and assess the likely effectiveness of these kind of the layering of these programs in actually effectuating change. That is a much more strategic way to use our resources. It is a clear path for me for interagency coordination, which I know we're going to talk about, because you start to think about how can we leverage what the DoD is doing? How can we leverage what aid is doing? The third thing, and I realize I'm taking up too much of the oxygen here, so apologies, is to foot stomp the report's emphasis and Sam's emphasis on a value-based approach to public diplomacy and strategic communications. And I would add to that a positive vision for the world. When we talk about public diplomacy and strategic communications, we really need to start thinking about what is the message we want to convey to the world that brings them into our circle and promises something that is of interest not just to us, but also to them. And one value that I think is really important to this, and it goes to what I think is the most profound, important decision relevant to public diplomacy in the last 18 months, is transparency. And that is just a bit over a year ago, the US government's decision, and it was a hard decision, to declassify robust amounts of intelligence and then share that information publicly and with partners that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, and to convince our European partners and also partners around the world that this was an inevitability unless we did something to try to stop it, was the most important public diplomacy move of the last 18 months, hands down. And so thinking about not just the public diplomacy programs, but also what other levers can we pull, declassifying information to shape the narrative about what's going to happen, working with our interagency partners is really important to constructing this cohesive, positive message based in values that is crucial to a successful return of America's strategic communications.
Thank you all for incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking opening comments. A key attribute of any moderator is self-editing, so I will do that now, remove some of my questions, because with the hard stop at 7:30, I really do want to engage the conversation with all of you and those in the virtual world as well. If anything has become obvious in the past couple of decades, that the challenges facing our nation, the threats, the risks, can only be countered by a whole of government approach. It's also not a secret that whole of government doesn't always play very well. There's competition, there's stovepiping, there's even tribalism out there. So how would you see this nation, this government, not who's in charge, but how do we synchronize? How do we coordinate messages in an effective way?
Who should go first, Tom?
Sam.
Can you hear me? I'll try this. Can you hear me now? Of course, I got the phone mic. All right. I'll borrow yours. Thank you. Yeah, I think, when I was looking at this, and it was helpful to actually look across the span of history, because things there's nothing new under the sun. There have been attempts, numerous attempts at coordination in fits and spurts across numerous administrations. But what often seems to happen, at least from my view, is that these attempts are fly by night and they tend to be superficial. And what often is the roadblock is like you have to get the incentives right for coordination. So you can have like a coordinator that has no resources, no like carrots and sticks you can use to actually get people around the table. And so what often happens is that the coordination group boils down to, well, we'll coordinate on talking points rather than actually having a meaningful discussion of like strategy, sharing information, talking about activity. So I think whatever you do with the boxes on the org chart, you need to get the incentives right by aligning the person in that position to have the resources to incentivize that.
I absolutely. It's bureaucratic, not very sexy, but creating the right structure for those incentives to be there is crucial. There's a couple ways to do it. Some of it's internal, some of it's congressional. But I think that a lot of those ideas are at least bubbling up in the work of GRI, but also the commission. I would add just another way to think about this is oftentimes interagency conversations about strategic communications are framed from the perspective of why do they get so many resources? Those resources would be better off in my budget. And I've seen it, I've felt it, but when you start from that point, coordination is going to be a failure because everyone thinks you're trying to take a piece of their pie. And so where I've had success is you start the conversation by recognizing what the other interlocutors, the other offices bring to the table. Here are the things that we know that they're doing, that they're investing in, and here's the possible impact they can have. And then thinking about how you can use your resources to build on those successes, to do that layering, that pathway that I mentioned before. And when you start to recognize the value of your partners, and instead of trying to take the resources, say, yeah, if we do this together, it's actually 2 + 2 = 5, then you start to build the relationships that really facilitate strong, robust interagency coordination.
Great. Well, my colleagues have said most of what I would have said, but I just add a couple of things. One, historically, you're correct. I mean, there have been numerous attempts to try to organize, calibrate again the various institutions and agencies that are involved in public diplomacy. One thing I will observe, and I think Nick Call might have mentioned it in his piece for this report, but he's done a very good job of this elsewhere, is that it's very often when we've been most successful in coordination is when we're up against conflict or war of one kind or another. That seems to have a concentrating factor that puts some of the bureaucratic and resource competitions to one side. That, however, does not really bring us much comfort when we're looking for some consistency across the board, not in wartime, so that we can then actually better prepare to be responsive when conflict arises. So I just add that. But as we've recommended in the report, I don't think we need to create yet another bureaucracy. I don't think we can or should create yet another institution or agency whose job it will be to coordinate. We talk about bureaucracy now. You create a new bureaucracy, you will never get anything done. So I think we have to work, back to my point earlier about not reinventing, but reinvesting. I think we have to work within existing structures. Second thing I would say, and something we say within the commission has said for many years, is we could stand to elevate the position of the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. As you pointed out, we're very pleased that Elizabeth Allen has been the current acting senior official, has been put forward. We would like to see that position elevated to the point where the responsibility is across the department and across the interagency. The undersecretary has great assistant secretaries to take care of the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs and Global Public Affairs Agency and the Global Engagement Center. Great people can take care of these things. Why not elevate the position? So, put it out there. And another option that we've explored, again, with the commission is maybe re-energizing the role of the NSC in all of this and turning the NSC into a more explicit sort of coordinating and convening function for all of the players involved.
Thanks. I do need to press all three of you on the word incentive and incentivize. You said we must incentivize. Okay. How do you do that? Does this require presidential level in incentivization? I mean, people often refer to the PEPFAR program, something under President Bush, that a lot of people only think of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but because there was presidential interest in combating HIV, AIDS in Africa, one of the most successful outreach programs ever. So how do you incentivize within the government? How do you incentivize Congress? Because Vivian mentioned the huge budget cuts. And how do you incentivize the American people to join you in this effort? Let's go backwards. Vivian, you have some thoughts?
Well, let me start with the American people. Right? And what we're currently looking at and calling public diplomacy's domestic dimension. Early in the administration, the Biden administration, became clear that there was going to be an emphasis on foreign policy for the middle class. They've since moved away from that term, and I think it's a good idea. The point being that there's real value in engaging the American public about what we're doing in the foreign policy arena, so that Americans can understand, how actions taken abroad serve their own interests. And indeed, the focus on this domestic dimension made it into the October 2022 National Security Strategy. I might add more prominently than public diplomacy, but that's another conversation. And so I think there is real value in bringing the domestic constituency along to understand the value of actions in the foreign policy sphere. And you start there. So that would be my thought on that.
I think one way is so a lot of U.S. government coordination comes at the urging or the request of the National Security Council, but not every part of the NSC is created equally. There are certain parts of the NSC that are closely aligned with the president and the president's policy priorities and of course our national security advisor. And those folks, those offices, they can drive interagency coordination at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. And I've felt that. And I've also never felt that level of NSC interest and coordination in the realm of public diplomacy. And so it comes down to people. It's naming people that are trusted and capable by the President of the United States, by the rest of the National Security Council, with a specific mandate to get our global communications shop in order and to deliver on the White House's priorities.
Yeah, Sam, but also Congress.
Yeah, so I do have something on Congress, actually. So I wrote down a couple of notes to myself. So how do you get the incentives right? So one is having a strategy, so what are we trying to achieve with this? And I think one of the things that we recommended in the report is you do have the new Biden national security strategy out. You do a keyword search like I did as a nerd. No mentions of public diplomacy, strategic communications, anything. Tons on influence though. So how are we influencing? What are we using? And so it seems to me that there's an opportunity there to develop an actual plan or strategy for how strategic communications and public diplomacy should advance our national security interests, make that kind of the touchstone. I think on congressional engagement, we've talked a lot about the executive branch. Let's not let Congress off the hook here. Congress has the power of appropriations that can set the tone for what gets funded, how it's funded, and how we hold each other to account. What was fascinating to me is I did some of the historical research. We actually poured into congressional documentation of any mentions of public diplomacy, strategic communications. When you have executive branch agencies that are coming to Congress and saying, we actually think we can cut funding over here, we'd rather put it over there, it's more effective, and then be told, no, never mind, just do what you've been doing before, that doesn't really set the right incentives. And so how do you actually marshal Congress to be setting the tenor of this, to say, okay, if you have this strategy, we need to see resources tied to that. I think on the innovation fund, innovation side of things, if you have a coordinator that has resources that they can deploy in ways that reinforce the behaviors that we want to see, such as pilot innovations that say, okay, we want to see DoD and state working on this. We want to see AGM and state working on this together. Put in a compelling proposal. We'll free up some resources to do that. It's kind of a way of reinforcing things. And then finally, access. One of the things that I noticed from history, and Nick's piece is just phenomenal on this. Like, if you look over time, we've had greater success on coordination if people believe the coordinator has the ear of the president. And that's really critical.
Thanks so much. One more question from the chair before I invite audience participation. Sean mentioned the horrific tragedy of the war in Ukraine. Tomorrow's the 1-year anniversary of that aggressive offensive by the Russians. Great success, as you mentioned, declassifying intelligence before, which also I think went a long way to removing the stain of the UN presentation before the invasion of Iraq. As taxpayers, we should be proud that the intelligence community can get it right and that the government released the information properly. But I'd love to hear all three of you talk a little bit about public diplomacy, strategic communication since then. How's the U.S. doing? What does the road ahead look like? And what will success look like in that space? Sam, what's you first?
Well, I did just write a piece on historically what happened, so I could start with that. What's interesting, so, recognizing the 1-year anniversary is coming up, we had done actually before Russia invaded Ukraine, we had been doing research to try to understand Russia's tools of influence in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. And one of the things that we saw very clearly was Russia using various instruments of power, particularly its media efforts, broadcasting, as well as some of its public diplomacy investments for years prior to the invasion, trying to seed the ground and exploiting 3 cleavages: language, culture, and identity, language, religion, and identity, and trying to stoke discontent within the Ukrainian community in the hope that that would weaken resolve and would allow them to cultivate sympathizers. So to me, I think that struck me as, okay, yeah, maybe the U.S. took its eye off the ball in this respect and missed that opportunity to see what a slow and steady buildup this actually was. So I think when we look at the situation now, I think Vivian and Sean would have much better insight on like what we're doing right now. But I think like what I would say from my perch is it's going to be important to have this strategic patience because, what we do today, we may not see for years to come, and we will be judged on our staying power. How much do we stay engaged and pay attention beyond this crisis moment?
Great. So that's and want to emphasize the strategic patience aspect is so crucial. And I think it's something we need to message repeatedly because bureaucrats and members of Congress and political appointees often don't have strategic patience just by the nature of their work. 2 examples of success that come to mind. The first is the work of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in and around Ukraine since the invasion. They have done an incredible job of keeping and deploying their 125 plus journalists throughout the country, keeping those journalists mostly safe. They did lose 1 journalist early in the war, but mostly safe, and covering the conflict in ways that has been so remarkable that I've seen RFERL's video footage on every major American newscast, including Fox News, MSNBC, you name it, in ways that has never happened in modern history. They are covering the conflict from every county that touches the conflict, as well as in Kyiv and Lviv. They forward deployed communications equipment like satellite phones and circumvention tools to make sure that their journalists could communicate with one another, and of course with the headquarters in Prague prior to the invasion, expecting that they would be hacked, expecting that the communications networks would be taken down, and they wanted to make sure they could still get their photos and videos uploaded so they could be broadcast live, not just to Ukrainians, but also people around the world. Since the invasion, they've also launched a new satellite TV service that exclusively covers the conflict in Ukraine 24/7, as well as invested in AM radio infrastructure in case the satellite goes down, in case the internet is cut off, because we have to prepare for multiple layers of communications architecture in the current kind of geopolitically contested environment. The second example of success is mostly unrelated to the US government, and that is the fact that YouTube is still accessible in Russia. YouTube is the only Western platform that is still accessible in Russia, and as a result, Russian citizens are by definition able to connect and able to access information that is not coming directly from the Russian government. Without YouTube being accessible in Russia, I would be deeply, deeply concerned about any ability of the US government or others to communicate directly with Russians on any scalable basis. And so sometimes success is US government investing in programs, being smart, and trying to get ahead of actions by adversaries. Sometimes it is working to make sure that people can access private sector platforms that do some of the work of public diplomacy for us.
And we're on YouTube tonight, right? Terrific, thank you. Добрый вечер, все в порядке here. Всего доброго.
Thank you. I just want to add that the work, frankly, that USAGM in particular, RVRL, is doing in this regard is absolutely phenomenal. So all kudos to that. As you might expect, from the perspective of the Department of State, our focus in supporting Ukraine is really in the short term in messaging, consistency of messaging, getting information out there, and then the work that's being done by the Global Engagement Center in terms of countering disinformation narratives and focusing on the malign actors in that regard. There is a success that I want to talk about, though, and it's a success that's not necessarily a U.S. government success. It's a Ukrainian success. Sam alluded to this earlier. What the Russians have engaged in a vicious attack on Ukraine in the last year, but of course, the attack on Ukraine on the ground and in the global information space began well before that. It began in 2014. And in terms of what Russia tried to do to Ukraine then and what it is doing to Ukraine now, is a weaponizing culture. It is taking every opportunity to degrade Ukraine's identity, its language, its legitimacy. And going back to our original point about the importance of understanding the relationship between a country's soft power legitimacy and its national security, the Ukrainians very quickly came to understand that if they were going to be credible in the global information space, if they were going to be able to make the case as to why we should be supporting Ukraine, why we should be partnering with them, why we should look to the war right now, but also to look to Ukraine in the future, they would have to make a case about who they were and what they represented. And it had to be a different story than the one that Russia was telling. So one enormous success has been the work of the Ukrainian Institute, which is similar to the British Council or Alliance Française. It was actually stood up in about 2018 in cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And their sole job is to get Ukraine's culture, language, intellectual legacy out to the world. And I'll give you a notable example and one that you might have even heard of. Anyone hear about the Carol of the Bells concert at Carnegie last December? Carol of the Bells, we know it as the Carol of the Bells. It was originally a Ukrainian composition. And so a children's choir from Ukraine came to Carnegie and did a marvelous show around the Carol of the Bells. So the deputy director of the Ukrainian Institute actually told me the story. She was talking to a journalist from the New York Times, and he was there to write, well, get to write this culture story, right? And then he looked at the kids, on stage, these young people who were singing, and he said, so wait a minute. So after this, they're going back to Kyiv, they're going back to bomb shelters, they're going back to, losing friends and family and yeah. And the journalist's reaction was, now this is a story that the American people need to hear. And in fact, we did hear a tremendous amount about the Carol of the Bells. That is an example of success. That is a powerful example of Ukraine taking control of its own narrative about its identity, about who they are, and at the same time telling an incredible story about resilience.
Thank you so much. So grateful to our panelists for being here. We're also very grateful for all of you coming out this evening. So I'd like to start with 2 questions from the audience, and then we'll move to the YouTube. Yes, ma'am, please.
I did my best for you to see Convene on Facebook. And Ring was a journalist to meet the secretary. They were lots of media from the White House. We did lots of media from the state. We did lots of media from the NSC. But in the words of Jim Jeffrey, this is not a communications problem. This is a policy problem. And it did not change until the Chancellor of William and Mary and Condi and General Petraeus came up with the surge. So we could have done every bit of communications known to God, as we did. Everyone from the State Department, I put everyone in the State Department, Deputy Secretary for Media Affairs, Public Affairs, and you know what working in defense is like when you're at state. We hate each other, and so it's very hard to coordinate. And so, it's there's going to have to be a policy decision made sooner or later.
Thoughts, comment? It goes to the stage you have of Admiral Mullen, and that it's easier to communicate good policy than bad policy.
I'll just jump right in. I think one of the challenges that public diplomacy as a practice in an institution has had all along is that people look to success or failure in terms of, are people more open or accepting to our policies? Unfortunately, despite your best efforts, public diplomacy can get the information out there. It can explain why we're doing what we're doing. It can illustrate the fundamental values that are driving our particular position or actions, but it can't change someone's mind. People have to change their own minds and make their own decisions about policy. The best that we can do is give them as much information as we can to make a decision that we hope will be in our best interests. But public diplomacy cannot fundamentally change people's attitudes toward policies. It can give them the tools to analyze, to assess, and perhaps to change their minds.
I guess I've got a lot to say on this, but I'll say of course, the disconnect between policy and communications is a fundamental problem when it exists, and it is extremely difficult to overcome if you're sitting on the communication side without strong relations on the policymaking side. Absolutely. However, there are a number of examples where the policy is actually right, but we can't get the communications right. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I'll give you an example. At the end of the last administration, there was a strong push to push international partners away from Chinese owned and operated 5G telecommunications infrastructure. It was a top policy priority for the White House, top priority for the State Department. And the way we phrased that policy debate was, you have to choose between us and the Chinese. You cannot try to have both. Our technology is better, it's safer, it's more secure. It's also much more expensive. We can't help you with that. But you can't. The Chinese technology can't be trusted. You have to choose ours instead. And that turned the vast majority of countries away from us. They said, look, you've been telling us to get online for 20 years, and now we're getting online with technology that's cheaper and faster than yours. And now you're coming back to us and saying, no, you've got to buy American technology for twice the cost. Get lost. Because the policy was right. That people shouldn't be trusting Chinese 5G architecture. I can go on for hours about that. Policy was right. How he communicated that policy was dead wrong. And I think there's a lot of examples where we have to be smarter about communicating good policy decisions to try to increase the effectiveness of those policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point you raised is important, that sometimes you're dealing with a policy problem that's not strictly a communications problem. But I think that was one of the points of the report, actually, was to say, we need to link strategic communications and public diplomacy more clearly to our foreign policy decisions, our national security decisions. Strategic communications and public diplomacy people should be in the room when these decisions are being made, and that you're thinking about how can strategic communications and public diplomacy help inform, help engage these publics, not as an afterthought, but as part of the process. The other thing I'll say is, I think the reason why we framed the report as we did is we wanted to, when you say strategic communications, sometimes we can jump to the idea of we're just talking at people, we're pushing information out. But I think that one of the things that we tried to draw in on the report was this, it's about a dialogue back and forth. And so when I think about the challenges of whether it was a policy problem or communications problem, something like the Indo-Pacific strategy, when it was put out there, it said, well, this is not about competing with China. This is about the region and strengthening U.S. relationships. And what did the recipient audiences say? Well, this is you competing with China. And is that because of the way the thing was designed, or is it just that the communications fell apart? But that should have been an opportunity for back and forth dialogue, for iteration, and say, we've got something that isn't quite working the way that we wanted. How do we make this right?
Thanks. Question? Yes, all the way in the back, please. If you wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I have a question in terms of two other instruments that we haven't talked about a lot this evening. So one is international organizations and international frameworks. How does that play into helping Reinvest and strategic communications? And B, there's this YouTube that you mentioned a bit, but how about private sector? Both these large corporations, tech companies, but also private organizations that are doing development, for example, foundations and others. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I could think of two different ways that could be relevant to this. So one is, I think, Sean's great point from earlier about, really being mindful about broadening our understanding of what we mean by strategic communications and public diplomacy here when we think about who's setting the rules of the game, the norms, the standards. International organizations often play that role. I was teaching a class for Ryan, and a student asked me, could we get an international regime about the appropriate use of information, or to end disinformation? I said, well, that might be a little overly optimistic, but I like where you're thinking. And it's about when you have common standards, rules of the game there. I think the other piece, though, is the power of knowing who the face of the message is and who is the most credible actor. It's not lost on me that one of the biggest coups for China with the Belt and Road Initiative was getting the UN Secretary General to say the Belt and Road Initiative is going to help us advance the SDGs. Wow, right? You've got an international organization, no obvious vested interest with a single country basically endorsing your strategy. So those two channels, I would say.
Yeah, well said on the international organization front. The only thing I'd add on that front is leveraging the values that are baked into these institutions as we think about our positive vision for the world, right? Because those institutions have been approved by consensus and unanimous vote decade after decade, and the values that are baked into those charters and missions are meaningful to audiences around the world. So it's important for us to walk the walk and live up to those rules, regulations, and principles that we've committed to for so long, but then leverage them and remind people when they are violated by adversaries that those actions are in contravention to foundational international norms that have brought shared peace and prosperity for much of the last century. On the private sector question, I think it's crucial. We have to be thinking about how to leverage, work with, and sometimes nudge the private sector. I think it depends really which part of the private sector are we talking about. One area that we have not gotten into here, but I think it would be an interesting initiative. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think it is ongoing, but there's a lot of concern around the world that social media platforms are not doing enough to contain disinformation, but also not doing enough to protect the safety of children. And there's some concern domestically, but I think that there's a real concern abroad, and working with platforms so they better understand that there are serious concerns about the safety of those platforms with children abroad is in our best interest, because if we can solve that problem, it increases the likelihood that those platforms will be allowed to function in foreign countries, which, as I said before, if the platform's not working, if YouTube's not allowed in Russia, we're all in big trouble. So just one area where we can do more.
I don't have too much to add. I would agree completely on the role of international organizations and the importance of leveraging those relationships. I would simply add to that something that I think you did very well in the report, and that is talking about not just partnering with international organizations, but partnering with like-minded allies. And in some sense, it's the same idea. You can the enormous multiple multiplier benefits when working with allies to project message to influence on issues of mutual strategic importance. That gives you a level of credibility, just like with the international organizations, in local, on a local or regional level that you might not have as a standalone U.S. government messaging or initiative. So, in total agreement on that, and also in agreement with the need to leverage private sector relationships. It's certainly something that within the Department of State, in the Office of Policy and Resources, they're looking at ways to build more relationships with private sector entities to pursue our objectives in the realm of public diplomacy. The challenge we do run into, and I think we alluded to earlier, we talk about either legislative constraints or resource constraints or process or bureaucratic constraints that sometimes can get in the way of building relationships with the private sector that allow us to pursue these objectives.
Thank you. For our last question, Cassie, would you bring in the virtual audience on YouTube, please?
Yes, and so I hope that we'll have more time to answer some of the virtual questions, but I would be remiss if I did not ask the question that I have had written in. So this is from Nicholas Cole. So Nick is another author of one of the Gates Forum reports, and he is a scholar and educator in the field of public diplomacy. So his question for the panel is, how does the panel feel that public diplomacy educators and researchers can support U.S. public diplomacy at this moment and moving forward?
I'll jump right in because I pre-baked my answer on this one, and just great to hear from you, Professor Cole. Nick was on my committee at USC Edinburgh, so it's great to connect as always. But I thought about this for some time today. I mentioned these pathways for strategic communication initiatives to be layered on one another. We need research to understand what are the different possible pathways. What is the order of operations? Which program should be stacked on top of which program? Do we start with exchange programs? Do we start with communications initiatives? Do we start with training initiatives? And what's the best way to follow that up? And what's the best way to follow that up? Those are research questions that we need help with. And I assure you that at the current staffing levels, the State Department is probably not properly equipped to answer on their own.
To add to that, and hello, Nick. It's wonderful to hear from you, even at this room. One of the things I've discovered in my second incarnation as an adjunct professor in various places is the very interesting, creative, and out-of-the-box ways to think about public diplomacy concepts. We at the Department of State have a tendency to define it in a very particular way. What I'm learning from my students and my students at Georgetown, my students at USC CPD, is that there are multiple ways to think about public diplomacy and communications. You can approach it through science, technology, and international affairs. You can approach it through the environment. You can approach it through climate. And I think one way in which PD educators and researchers can help us is how to make us more creative about the way we think about the problem set and where we draw inspiration and best practices. It does not have to be limited to that very narrow definition of what public diplomacy is. So that's where I see it.
Two different avenues I see. So one is on the training side, training of the next generation of public diplomacy practitioners. It strikes me that we're not in the age of there's a rote cookie cutter program for public diplomacy and strategic communications that you can plug and play in anywhere in the world. And what that means is that it's a higher discretion exercise where we need to increase the confidence and creativity and flexibility of our PD professionals to think creatively about those pathways, think about audience analysis, all of these pieces that are really complex. And then the other area, because I'm a researcher, I'll really hit this home. Monitoring and evaluation. How do we know if we're being successful? This is extremely difficult to measure, but we need to train people to think about what indicators should we be monitoring to know whether this is working or not, and how do we bake that into decision making? And that's a way that educators can be part of the solution.
Thank you. Super fast question, please do.
I'm Brent Colbert, class of '98, class of 2000 MPP at William & Mary. Thank you all for doing this and for everything you've done in your careers in this space. True or untrue, fair or unfair, whenever we talk about this in the United States, I think people leave with the impression that we're behind. Putting yourself in the shoes of our competitors, do they believe they're ahead? How do China and Russia actually perceive the balance of power in this space?
It's a good question. Got a couple of gut reactions. I'm not sure if I should share them. So but I will. I think my first reaction is, who cares? I don't care how the Russians or the Chinese see themselves in this great power competition, because it doesn't actually impact the effectiveness of our programs. But I don't mean that as like it's a bad question. It's a great question. It's a provocative question. But I think there's some truth to this. Like, I don't think that's where we should be spending our time. I'll say the second thing that comes to mind is the clarifying power of great power competition. Go back in time 10 years, and the future of public diplomacy was murky, in large part because we didn't know what the purpose of public diplomacy was. We didn't know what the purpose of parts of our foreign policy were. We now know we are in a great power competition, primarily with China, somewhat with Russia, but that, some would say that Russia's on the brink of being a failed state, so probably not as big of a risk as China. And as a result of that, it's incredibly clarifying as to where we should be putting our resources and our focus and our time. And I think that gives us quite a bit of an advantage vis-a-vis some of our competitors.
I think they see us as a threat. And I think it's that threat, that fear, that what we represent, what we promote is fundamentally not in their interests, in their, so I agree with Sean. Don't lose sleep over what they worry about.
Yeah, I think so. Partly, initially, I think they were looking to us to learn. If you look particularly with the case in China, which has a longer track record in this, like a lot of the tools that they have been using, a lot of the tactics they have been using, have been used by the U.S. and other great powers at one time or another. And so there's some of that of like, okay, let me take pages out of other playbooks. There's definitely iteration. I don't know that I don't think it's a binary, like we're ahead, you're not kind of thing. I think it's like a sliding scale. So I think that for China in particular, I'm more familiar with China, less familiar with Russia, but China has learned how to increase its visibility. That has been a success. And maybe they're feeling like, because you have all of these tools at your disposal to do that more easily, that's a success. But with that is coming more scrutiny. And I don't think that they're necessarily winning on that front. And that's a lot harder.
Thanks. Well, clearly the interest and enthusiasm here shows that we could continue this conversation longer. And in fact, we can in a more casual sense at the back of the room, hosted by William & Mary and the Global Research Institute. But sincerest thanks to the panelists for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking evening, and to all of you for joining us to discuss this very important topic. Thank you.
I know.